8 million viewers, and called her a traitor to her own community. The lights blazed, the trap was set, and the media had already hung the verdict. But Jasmine didn't flinch. The calm in her eyes wasn't surrender, it was strategy. And what she did next didn't just flip the narrative, it detonated it. What truth was so explosive? It left the accuser scrambling for cover on her own stage. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. It started not with a bang, but with a whisper buried in the static of a sleepless night. At exactly 2:17 a.m., an email slipped quietly into the inbox of a senior producer at The View. The subject line read in all caps, "For immediate review, confidential Crockett intel." Attached, an 18-page PDF stamped with a blood-red watermark, confidential. The sender identified only as J. Kelmer, whistleblower. The producer opened it. What she saw made her bolt upright, allegations that Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett had accepted a secret $75,000 donation from Datamine, a data analytics firm previously under federal scrutiny for racially profiling users through AI behavior algorithms. Worse still, the report claimed Crockett had privately met with Datamine's executives just months before the firm launched a predictive policing pilot in minority neighborhoods. Within minutes, the document was flagged, forwarded, and escalated. By 7 a.m., it was on Joy Behar's desk, still warm from the printer. The trap hadn't been set in daylight. It had been engineered in the silence, when no one could see it coming. By 10 a.m. that same Monday, the ambush was underway. Joy Behar, seated at the round table of The View, held up the printed report like it was the final verdict in a courtroom drama. Her fingers gripped the paper just tight enough to shake it on cue. She leaned in toward the camera, her voice steady but laced with venom. A woman who claims to fight for justice, yet allegedly accepts money from a company that's exploited the Black community for profit? If this is true, Jasmine Crockett isn't just a hypocrite, she's a traitor to her people. There were audible gasps from the audience. No context, no confirmation, no call to Crockett for comment. Just a televised execution in broad daylight. The co-host nodded solemnly, feeding the tension. The words hung in the air like a sentence already served. Without trial, without evidence. By noon, the digital firestorm had ignited. Crockett's name began to spread like wildfire across social media, picked up by bot accounts, political pundits, and rage-driven echo chambers on both sides. News sites rushed out clickbait headlines like sharks smelling blood. Crockett caught in data scandal. New racism scandal. Taints Civil Rights Committee. No outlet bothered to verify. No one asked for the source. What mattered was that the story sounded believable because it fit the narrative they wanted. In a matter of hours, Jasmine Crockett's name was dragged through the mud of 1,000 timelines. People she'd marched with, bled with, and fought for were now tweeting with question marks, wondering if they'd backed the wrong woman. Truth hadn't just taken a hit. It had been buried beneath the illusion of proof. And the worst part? She hadn't even been given the chance to speak. But while the headlines screamed betrayal and the pundits polished their outrage, something far quieter and far more deliberate was taking shape behind sealed office doors. Inside the heart of Capitol Hill, where loyalty is often traded like currency, Jasmine Crockett stood alone. The silence from her own party wasn't accidental, it was calculated. By Tuesday morning, she noticed it everywhere. Longtime supporters pausing before mentioning her name on cable panels, junior staffers suddenly out sick, and more tellingly, a slow drip of deleted endorsements on social media. One former ally, a senator who once called her a rising force for justice, sent a message through an aide suggesting she take a tactical leave from the Civil Rights Committee to protect its institutional integrity. Another, a well-known strategist, called her directly and spoke in euphemisms. "Maybe it's time to cool the room down, Jasmine. Let this storm pass over." But Jasmine knew storms don't just pass. They're either survived or they consume, and she wasn't built to run. What the public saw was a void. No tweets, no press conferences, no viral videos from her office condemning the attack. Political commentators spun it as panic. "She's cornered," they said. If she had nothing to hide, she'd be shouting her innocence. But what they didn't see, what they couldn't see, was the war room unfolding one floor beneath her public office. Jasmine had converted her conference space into a bunker of intention. The long glass table, usually reserved for policy briefings and budget strategy, was now covered in digital schematics, metadata maps, and printed reports with fluorescent tabs marking inconsistencies. She didn't gather PR advisors or image consultants. She gathered experts, 4 to be exact, each handpicked, each sworn to secrecy. At the head of the table was Marisol Drake, a digital forensics analyst from Boston who once cracked a multinational ransomware ring. Across from her sat Ellis Trent, a legislative investigator from the House Ethics Subcommittee, known for bringing down 2 corporate lobbyists in 2021. Beside him was Damian Holt, a lawyer specializing in AI ethics and federal data misuse, currently on sabbatical after testifying before the FTC. And then there was the 4th chair, occupied by a man in a navy hoodie and ball cap pulled low, eyes half hidden, voice steady but quiet. He didn't use his real name. Jasmine only referred to him as the Node. A former systems architect at Datamine, he'd walked away 2 years ago when their algorithms were repurposed for what he called civilian targeting. No one had heard from him since, until Jasmine reached out directly through encrypted channels. Jasmine remained standing, one hand on the edge of the table, the other gripping a yellow legal pad. No teleprompters, no aids, just notes in her handwriting. Tight, small, focused. She didn't pace. She didn't fill the silence with explanations or complaints. She let it hang, long enough to make everyone feel the gravity of what they were being brought into. Then she spoke, not with fire, but with weight. What they did wasn't just political, it was engineered. This report wasn't leaked. It was launched, crafted with precision, seated at a precise hour, designed to detonate when I couldn't respond. She flipped open the legal pad, revealing a diagram. Timestamps, server metadata, domain histories. The leak's origin didn't align with the whistleblower's alleged email. The formatting of the PDF revealed use of a metadata scrubber used only by private contractors. More than that, there were deliberate errors. Legal terminology inserted incorrectly to sound official to the untrained eye. Jasmine circled a date in red ink and looked at each of them in turn. This wasn't about me. It was a prototype, a template. They chose me because they thought I'd react like everyone else, with rage, with press releases, with flailing denials. But I don't play defense. I build cases. Damian, the lawyer, leaned forward. So what's the plan? Quiet legal pushback? Federal complaint? Jasmine shook her head slowly. Then came the sentence that reset the entire tone of the room. I'm not going to fight it behind closed doors. I'm going to walk straight into the room they built to bury me. I'll bring every receipt, and I'll do it live, right on The View, where they fired the first shot. No one spoke for a moment. Marisol's pen stopped mid-scribble. Ellis exhaled slowly. The man in the hoodie didn't flinch. He only nodded. Jasmine looked around once more, her voice steel and resolve. I don't want spin. I want the source. I want the angle. I want the digital trail. In 72 hours, I'm going on national television, not to react, to reconstruct. This wasn't crisis management. This was tactical exposure. Jasmine Crockett wasn't hiding. She was preparing to strike with something more lethal than outrage, undeniable truth. While Jasmine was quietly assembling a surgical team of truth seekers, the producers at The View weren't waiting for her side. They were already scripting the verdict. Inside the ABC broadcast compound on West 66th Street, the atmosphere wasn't tense. It was clinical, cold, purposeful. In a soundproofed editing bay, surrounded by high-resolution monitors and timecode trackers, 2 lead producers leaned over a paused video frame from 2022. The footage had been pulled from a press package covering the International AI Governance Summit in San Jose. On screen, Jasmine Crockett in a navy suit, surrounded by attendees, reaching out to briefly shake hands with a man in a badge-labeled lanyard. Vernon Hale, the CEO of Datamine. The exchange lasted just under 14 seconds. No audio, no follow-up. Just the kind of innocuous interaction that happens hundreds of times at every public conference. But for the producers, it was gold. There, one of them said, marking the clip. That's our proof of connection. The other nodded. They trimmed it to 12.3 seconds. Then they added a digital zoom at the moment Jasmine smiled politely, slowing the frame ever so slightly, enough to create the illusion of familiarity. She looked relaxed. Too relaxed. Perfect. The graphics team was already working with pre-approved overlays, sharp block text in yellow and red, colors chosen to stimulate subconscious alert. Across the bottom, Jasmine X data mined? A question, not an accusation. But questions framed as graphics aren't questions at all. They're signals. In the upper left corner, undisclosed ties flickered beneath a pulsing animation of a data network web, subtly linking Jasmine to a broader digital conspiracy. They tested several music beds underneath, ultimately settling on a low percussive drone that gave the intro just enough tension without sounding overtly hostile. It was designed to make the viewer lean forward, feel suspicion, but not realize why. The producers called it emotional priming. In politics, it's called trial by montage. Meanwhile, in a glass-walled planning room one floor up, the lead segment writer was assembling the interview flow, not to investigate, but to prosecute. The list of questions was mapped like a chess match. Step 1, proximity. Why were you attending an invite-only cocktail hour with a company under federal scrutiny? Step 2, insinuation. Did any money change hands? Campaign donations, consulting fees, anything? Step 3, ridicule. So, we're to believe it was a coincidence you were photographed with the CEO. Step 4, pressure. Would you be willing to turn over all communications with DataMine under oath? Step 5, discredit. Some in your own party say your silence speaks volumes. What are you hiding? Step 6, finale. How can voters trust a leader whose tech affiliations come with more questions than answers? The cadence was deliberate, a rhythm of escalation. They didn't want Crockett to simply respond. They wanted her to unravel, live. No one in the room questioned the segment's integrity. Ethics weren't on the schedule. Not one person asked whether Jasmine had been given the footage in advance or offered the chance to supply context. No one paused to verify the chain of custody for the so-called leaked report. The assumption was that public perception would do the rest. One junior staffer tried to mention the term editorial responsibility. She was shut down with a glance. This wasn't a discussion. It was a production. The kind with a climax already storyboarded. The final segment file was labeled Crockett Segment Kashsh Hard Hit Master V3. One senior producer leaned back in his chair and said what everyone was already thinking. If she shows up, great, we finish her live. If not, we call it silence. And so while Jasmine Crockett was preparing evidence, timelines, digital forensics, and sworn statements, The View was preparing a performance. A 22-minute segment loaded not with facts, but with pressure points and optics. They didn't need her to confess. They just needed her to blink. What they hadn't planned for, what they couldn't predict, was that Jasmine Crockett wasn't coming to deny the trap. She was coming to name the architects, on their own stage, in real time. While producers choreographed their media ambush with cut clips and leading questions, Jasmine Crockett wasn't preparing a counter-argument. She was preparing a collapse. Not of her own defense, but of the entire machine that had dared to forge it. The binder lay flat on the mahogany desk like a quiet weapon, unassuming in appearance, lethal in its contents. Its matte black cover bore no label, no crest, no initials. Just silence. Jasmine had ordered it that way. There would be no hint of what was inside until she turned the pages in front of millions. Inside were 54 meticulously prepared sheets, each page anchored by evidence, not emotion. The first section, printed on thick cream cardstock and marked with a red tab, was titled Signature Deconstruction. Jasmine had enlisted not one, but two forensic handwriting experts, one from the National Archives, the other a private investigator known for exposing corporate fraud. Their findings were damning. The signature that appeared on the so-called data mine agreement wasn't written by hand. It had been reconstructed using multiple public records and machine-generated imitation, mimicking Jasmine's writing style down to the curve and angle of each stroke. One expert wrote in the margin, "This wasn't forged by a person. It was forged by a system designed to imitate trust." Jasmine underlined that sentence in red, twice. Behind that, clipped to the following pages and labeled Metadata Spine, was a full digital analysis of the document that had been aired on television. It proved that the file hadn't come from any government source. It had been created overseas early in the morning using pirated editing software. Timestamps, language encoding, and file structure all pointed to a forgery designed for distribution, not internal use. Buried deep within the data were notes indicating that it was formatted for television, complete with segment labels, placeholder prompts, and production-ready formatting. Jasmine printed out the entire report, highlighting every inconsistency and alteration in yellow. She didn't plan to explain it. She planned to show it, line by line, unedited, in full view of the audience that had only been shown shadows. The binder's core, however, was not paper. It was sound. In the center was a sealed drive containing a voice recording from a private meeting between executives at Datamine's public relations agency. In the clip, a senior official calmly discussed strategy. "We don't need it to be true. We just need it to circulate. If she speaks up too soon, we say she's defensive. If she waits, we say she's guilty. Either way, we win the first word." Jasmine had listened to that clip more than once, never flinching, never pausing. With every repetition, her anger didn't grow. Her clarity did. She had finally understood. The story wasn't about guilt or innocence. It was about speed, narrative, and who gets to speak first. And they had decided that she wouldn't. At the very back of the binder was the most volatile section of all, marked only by a tab of dark gray paper. This was the map. Jasmine and her team had traced every dollar that connected Datamine to the media channels that had aired the attack. It started with anonymous contributions to a political fund registered in Delaware. That fund funneled payments into a lobbying group called Citadel Insight, known for shaping narratives while avoiding scrutiny. From there, the money splintered into layered consulting agreements and media retainers, some of which landed in the hands of investment groups quietly backing the parent company that controlled the very network hosting The View. Jasmine didn't guess. She documented. She had payment receipts, federal filings, and tax records, marked, organized, undeniable. On the final page, she had written a single line in bold, centered, underlined. "The truth isn't hidden. It's being sold." This binder wasn't a plea for justice. It was a reckoning. It didn't shout. It didn't plead. It waited. And when Jasmine Crockett walked onto that stage, she wouldn't ask for fairness. She wouldn't even ask for time. She would turn each page methodically under their own lights until the very audience they hoped would judge her began to ask one question instead. Who forged this? And why were you so ready to believe it? And so, with the world watching and the lights calibrated for humiliation, Jasmine Crockett walked into the studio, not as a guest, but as a woman who had come to cross a line drawn for her by others and erase it with truth. At exactly 10:03 a.m., the red light above camera one blinked to life, signaling the beginning of what the producers hoped would be Jasmine Crockett's televised undoing. The studio was pristine, almost sterile, but under the soft hues of white and blue, tension hummed like static against glass. Joy Behar wasted no time playing coy. Her voice came out controlled, but with the edge of a veteran talk show host who knew she held the room's momentum in her palm. "Congresswoman Crockett," she said, turning ever so slightly toward the audience, "if you truly had no connection to Datamine, then why was that company's CEO listed among the VIPs at your private fundraising event in August of 2022? Her tone wasn't curious. It was rehearsed. The implication was laced with poison. Association equals guilt. Before Jasmine could respond, the massive LED screen behind the panel lit up with a photograph, an image carefully selected and strategically manipulated. It showed Jasmine in mid-laughter, champagne glass in hand, standing beside Vernon Hale of Datamine. They weren't touching, not even standing especially close. But the frame had been cropped tight, shadows deepened, saturation cooled to imply intimacy where there was none. The studio didn't erupt, but it didn't have to. A low ripple of murmurs spread across the audience, like the first tremor before a quake. A few people shook their heads, one gasped. That was all the camera needed to pan wide and catch the reaction it wanted. Joy leaned forward as if she'd just landed the decisive blow. "This isn't coincidence," she said, her voice low and punctuated. "This is the question. Who do we believe?" There it was. The challenge dressed as moral inquiry, framed to corner and condemn. Jasmine didn't move for a beat. She simply looked at the screen, letting the photo sit, letting the accusation breathe. Then slowly she turned back toward Joy, adjusted the cuffs of her jacket and sat taller, not defiant, not dismissive, composed. Her hands moved with unhurried precision as she reached for the leather case beside her chair. With a soft click, it opened. She didn't glance up. She didn't rush. She simply drew out a black binder, the same one built from days of tireless research, forensic evidence, and classified testimonies. The studio lights caught the slight gleam of the pages inside as she placed it firmly on the table between them. The weight of it landed with an audible thump, silencing the whispers instantly. Only then did Jasmine lift her gaze to Joy, not in anger, not in performance, but with a clarity that unsettled. "You asked who we should believe," she said, her voice quiet but unshakable. "I came to answer that, not with clever phrases, not with pre-rehearsed sound bites, with documentation." She placed her palm on the binder, firm and steady. "And I suggest we start here." For the first time since the segment began, Joy blinked. The audience leaned in. The camera didn't cut to the photo again. It didn't need to, because the moment had shifted. The trap had been laid for a target. But what sat in that chair now was a witness, a storm in tailored navy, armed with facts no filter could soften. The binder was open. The accusations were still hanging in the air. But Jasmine Crockett didn't flinch. She had come not to defend her name, but to expose what had been done in the dark, and who let it live in the light. With the eyes of the audience fixed on her, Jasmine pulled out the first document, its edges crisp, its header stamped with the official seal of the U.S. Department of Justice. She held it up, slowly and clearly, letting the room see it before she even spoke. Then calmly but firmly, she read, "There is no investigation, no charges, and no record of any financial transaction between Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett and Datamine Incorporated." The words hung in the air like a hammer crashing through glass. There were no loopholes, no vague legal terms, no hedging. Just a flat, final truth backed by the highest legal office in the country. She placed the document flat on the table and looked up, not with arrogance, but with the quiet confidence of someone carrying undeniable facts. It wasn't theater. It was evidence. And for the first time since the segment began, the audience wasn't leaning forward for drama. They were leaning forward for answers. Without missing a beat, Jasmine turned the next page. The screen behind her changed again, this time showing two signatures side by side. One was her real signature, taken from an official government document. The other came from the leaked report Joy Behar had waved around days earlier. At first glance, they looked nearly identical. But then Jasmine began pointing out the details, how the pressure points were too smooth, how the stroke angles were too exact. These weren't the imperfections of a human hand. They were the unnatural curves of a machine. "This isn't handwriting," she said clearly. "It's a synthetic copy, produced using artificial intelligence that mimics public records. My public records." She paused, then added, "They didn't just fake a signature. They used public trust as raw material to build a lie." That silence returned. Only now it wasn't discomfort, it was disbelief. But Jasmine wasn't finished. From the binder, she pulled another sheet, this one filled with digital forensics, a map of how the false file had been created and where. She laid it down slowly, then said, "The report didn't come from any official channel. It didn't come from any whistleblower in this country. It was made on an anonymous computer server located overseas, using a stolen editing tool, and designed to look like a real leak." Her finger landed on the final line of the page. "It was built to deceive. It was sent to spread. and it was delivered to you, Joy. The camera panned slightly, catching Joy's expression. Tight, unreadable, but no longer in control. Then Jasmine looked up, her voice low and steady. "So I ask again," she said, her tone no longer just questioning, but demanding. "If they could fake a member of Congress's signature and send it directly to you, what did you do to verify it before showing it to the nation?" No one spoke. The audience, the producers, even Joy herself, frozen. Because this wasn't just about Jasmine anymore. It was about how easily the truth had been sold, broadcast, and believed. And Jasmine had just turned the spotlight around. The room had been pierced by hard facts, flattened by paper proof. But Jasmine knew something else. Something far more dangerous was still missing. The soul of the lie, its voice. And she had brought it with her. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't wave papers. She didn't need to. Jasmine Crockett reached calmly into the inner pocket of her blazer, her fingers brushing against the cool surface of her phone. The studio lights above were steady, unblinking, like the eyes of a jury waiting for the next turn. The studio audience had quieted into a hush so complete that even the soft scrape of her fingernails against the leather table sounded like a signal. She unlocked the screen with a single swipe. No one spoke. Joy watched in silence, perhaps expecting another document, another denial, another line of defense. But what Jasmine pulled out was not silence, it was sound. She tapped once, then twice. A faint click echoed through the studio speakers. And then, without introduction, it began. A man's voice, relaxed, almost mechanical. "Just attach Crockett to the narrative. People won't verify anything. They'll see it, they'll share it, they'll believe it." A second voice, more clipped, younger, female. "What about the metadata trail?" The first man chuckled. "Don't worry. The media doesn't check file origin. They check buzz. The audience will do the rest. And if it goes sideways, well, it's already out there." Jasmine sat motionless. The screen behind her had gone dark. No headlines, no graphics, just black, letting the words fill the space like smoke. The voices continued. Another chuckle. Then a single name. TW Strategies. "We've seeded similar frames before. Cable shows love this kind of conflict. Add the race angle, add the hypocrisy label, and you've got a 2-day firestorm." The voice paused, then dropped the final line like a finishing blow. "You don't have to make it true. You just have to make it loud." A full 2 minutes. No music, no camera cuts, no interruption. In the control booth, the technical director stared at the countdown clock with his finger hovering above the panic switch. But there was nothing to cut to. This was live. No delay, no disclaimer. Just raw, unfiltered truth crashing into millions of living rooms with the violence of a slow revelation. Jasmine didn't speak while it played. She didn't even blink. Her hands rested gently on the edge of the binder, as if anchoring her to the moment. Her eyes remained steady, not on Joy, not on the audience, but on the space between, the invisible line where assumption ended and accountability began. The recording stopped. Silence poured into the studio like water breaking through glass. No applause, no gasps, just stillness. The kind that presses on your chest and makes the air feel thick. Jasmine's fingers moved again, just barely, and she set the phone face down on the table, like a judge placing a gavel. Then she turned her head. Her eyes met Joy Behar's, not with anger but with weight. It wasn't confrontation, it was reckoning. And in that frozen stare there was a strange, devastating calm, the kind that says, "You knew better, and you chose not to ask." Her voice came soft, but it cut through the room like broken light. "You didn't create this plot, Joy." She let that sit. "But you carried it. You gave it breath. You gave it legitimacy." Her hand gestured gently toward the phone, then returned to the table. "You gave it 8 million ears." Joy opened her mouth, but no words came. Her face, so often sharp with sarcasm and quick with counters, was frozen in place. There was no teleprompter line to rescue her. No producer's voice in her earpiece with a pivot. She was alone now, with a truth she had helped launch and could no longer redirect. Jasmine didn't look away. Her tone never rose, but somehow it carried heavier than any shout. "You know what makes this worse?" she said. "They didn't even try that hard. They didn't hide their tracks. They didn't bury the motive, because they didn't have to." She leaned slightly forward, not aggressive, but immovable. "Because they knew the moment it landed in your inbox, it wouldn't be questioned. It would be aired." A woman in the front row of the studio audience shifted uncomfortably in her seat. A man beside her crossed his arms tighter. Another leaned forward, eyes wide, brow furrowed, not in disbelief but dawning comprehension. Jasmine turned to the crowd now, her voice still calm but etched with something colder. "This is what they count on. Not violence, not chaos, not even hate." She paused. "They count on comfort, on trusted faces, trusted platforms, not asking questions, on people believing the first version they hear, especially if it confirms their worst assumptions." She let her words hang like exposed wires. Then she looked back at Joy, and this time there was a flicker of grief in her voice. "You didn't forge the document. You didn't fake the signature. You didn't record that call." Another pause. "But you took their lie, and you gave it a microphone." The pain wasn't theatrical. It was deeper than performance. It was the pain of someone who had fought to be heard, only to watch her name turned into a soundbite. The pain of watching a system built to inform become a machine that shreds context and rewards outrage. Jasmine reached once more for the phone, not to play another recording, but to slide it back into her pocket. Her hands were still, her breathing steady. And then she said the one sentence that broke what little defense remained around Joy's carefully constructed wall. "You didn't speak truth to power, Joy. You gave power to a lie." The moment didn't need music. It didn't need applause. It didn't even need reaction. Because it was no longer just about Jasmine Crockett or a forged report. It was about a deeper sickness, one that feeds on silence, shortcuts, and the slow erosion of accountability behind every camera lens in America. And Jasmine had just handed that sickness its own reflection. The room had just absorbed the most searing evidence of the morning. It echoed still in the minds of everyone watching, like a match dropped into a forest of dry leaves. But what came next wasn't anger or apology. It was something colder. Justification. Joy Behar finally spoke, her voice a shade too fast, a little too controlled, like someone trying to rehearse a calm that wasn't there. Her face was composed, but her hands betrayed her, fidgeting beneath the table as her fingers gripped the cue cards like they might anchor her to a version of reality already slipping away. "I just reported what was sent to us," she began. "It came to our producers through multiple channels. It wasn't my role to vet every detail in a leaked document." She tried to sound matter-of-fact, like a professional caught in the gears of an imperfect system. "We're a discussion show, not a courtroom." But even as she said it, her eyes avoided Jasmine's. They flicked to the cameras, to the audience, to anywhere else. The justification wasn't for Jasmine, it was for herself, and the viewers who might still believe she was impartial. For a moment, Jasmine Crockett said nothing. She let the space hang open, let Joy's words echo in the silence they didn't quite fill. She could have snapped back, could have weaponized the applause from earlier, but she didn't. Instead, she shifted slightly in her chair, squared her shoulders, and leaned forward. Her voice, when it came, was measured and resonant, not with anger, but with the gravity of truth that no longer needed to shout. "When you broadcast an unverified document," she said slowly, "not just to your viewers, but to an entire nation, without context, without corroboration, and without responsibility, you're not a reporter anymore, Joy." Her eyes met Joy's now, unblinking. "You become something else. You become the final mile of the manipulation, the face people trust, used to deliver something designed to deceive." Joy opened her mouth slightly, perhaps to interject, perhaps to defend herself again. But Jasmine didn't pause. "You're not the architect, I know that. You didn't forge the signatures or edit the footage or plant the audio," Jasmine continued. "But when you raised that document on live television, when you read from it as if it were gospel, you lent it the only thing it needed to do damage: credibility." She tapped a single finger gently against the polished glass table. "Yours." The room had grown colder, not in temperature but in tone. The lighting hadn't changed, but the mood had. Even the studio crew, seasoned professionals accustomed to on-air drama, stood frozen behind their cameras, arms crossed, breath held. They knew what they were watching wasn't entertainment. It was history. Jasmine didn't flinch. Her voice remained low, but it rippled with the quiet power of someone who had carried truth through fire and now stood with it unburned. People trusted you, Joy. They believed this show, this seat, came with a standard. You didn't just inform, you shaped perception. And perception, when built on falsehoods, can destroy careers, reputations, lives. She paused. Not for drama, but for clarity, for oxygen, for the weight of what she was about to say to truly settle. You weren't reporting, she said. You were distributing. You were platforming a weapon disguised as information. And whether you intended it or not, that makes you part of the campaign. It wasn't an insult. It wasn't a scream. It was a verdict. And then came something no one expected. Something unprecedented. Applause. Slow at first, a single pair of hands clapping from the back row of the studio audience, uncertain whether it was allowed. Then another joined. Then a third. And then, like a wave crashing over a quiet beach, the room erupted. Standing ovation. Spontaneous. Real. People on their feet, clapping with a force that seemed to rise from somewhere deeper than just admiration. It wasn't for a zinger. It wasn't for entertainment. It was for truth, delivered without fury, without spin, and without retreat. It was the first time in the history of The View that such applause had broken mid-show. Not for a celebrity, not for a musical guest, but for a woman who had sat still, spoken plainly, and dismantled an entire media tactic with 5 minutes and a phone. Jasmine didn't move. She didn't soak it in. Her face remained calm, eyes steady. This wasn't triumph. It wasn't vindication. It was justice, a small, overdue portion of it. Her hands rested gently on the table, unmoving. The ovation was not hers to claim. It belonged to the truth she had carried in, scuffed, bruised, but undeniable. Joy Behar remained seated, stunned, staring down at the cue cards as if they had betrayed her. The script she had expected no longer applied. The questions she'd written now felt hollow. Every follow-up she'd planned had become irrelevant in the face of what had just unfolded. No producer said a word in her ear. No commercial break arrived to rescue her. Only the sound of clapping, of chairs sliding as people stood. And then, at the center of it all, Jasmine Crockett. Quiet, controlled. The very embodiment of grace under fire. And though she hadn't raised her voice even once, she had just said everything. The confrontation had already shaken the room. But Jasmine wasn't here just to clear her name. She was here to show them something far bigger and far more terrifying than a smear campaign. It was time to pull the curtain all the way back. Jasmine didn't gesture for help. She didn't ask for a slide. She calmly unfolded a single sheet of paper, plain white, printed in black ink, but dense with consequence. The camera zoomed in instinctively, guided not by cues but by a sense of urgency. It was a map, not of geography, but of power. She laid it on the glass table between her and Joy, tapped the center circle with the tip of her pen, and said in a voice more surgical than theatrical, "Let's talk about data mined." The line from that name branched outward like veins, sharp, deliberate, damning. Jasmine continued, each word landing like a gavel. Data mine, the company I was accused of colluding with, receives capital investment from a financial group called Horizon Holdings. That's where the trail begins. Her finger moved to the next link. Horizon Holdings owns a controlling interest, 12%, in a lobbying and political intelligence firm called Citadel Insight. The name alone sent murmurs through the studio audience. Some had heard it before in headlines, often in footnotes. But what Jasmine was unveiling was no footnote. It was a system. Her voice didn't rise, but the air in the room grew tighter as she traced the final connection. Citadel Insight, for the past decade, has contributed millions to political campaigns, both overtly and through PACs. But more importantly, she paused, and for a moment, even the studio lights seemed to dim around her next sentence. Citadel also holds indirect but strategic influence over 3 of the largest media networks in America. Her eyes met Joy's. One of them is ABC. The reaction was instant, but not loud. It was internal, a collective breath held too long, a realization settling in like a cold wind under the skin. Jasmine didn't deliver it like an attack. She delivered it like a diagnosis, and there was no medicine in sight. She tapped the paper once more, softly but with meaning. "This wasn't about me," she said, the words slow and deliberate. "I wasn't the target. I was the trial run." Her gaze swept across the studio, then beyond, as if seeing the millions watching from their living rooms. They wanted to see if a well-timed lie, supported by carefully arranged connections, could survive on air long enough to become truth. She let that hang. The silence wasn't empty. It was loaded with implication. The audience, once erupting with claps, now sat frozen. Not because they doubted her, but because they were starting to remember headlines, narratives, fragments of certainty they'd once accepted without question. Jasmine took a breath, not for her sake, but for clarity. And if that worked, she said, they could try it again. On someone else. On something else. Until we're no longer citizens. We're just spectators, consuming whatever's been manufactured to keep us divided, confused, and distracted. She leaned forward, not with aggression, but with a strange calm that was somehow more powerful than rage. "The real question here isn't whether I was innocent," she said. "It's how many other stories, on these networks, in your feeds, through your screens, you've believed, without ever asking who wrote them and who paid for them to be written." Her final words came without theatrics, just clarity. "So no, I'm not just here to defend myself. I'm here to ask you this. What else have we believed without proof?" And in that moment, the paper in front of her didn't look like a diagram anymore. It looked like a mirror, held up not just to Joy, but to the entire machine. And what it reflected was something far more dangerous than one false report. A system that had grown used to never being questioned until now. The web had been laid bare, the diagram etched in the minds of millions. But even that, Jasmine knew, wasn't enough. Systems don't collapse under facts alone. They fracture when the silence around them is finally pierced by a question no one wants to answer. Jasmine didn't turn to Joy. She didn't search for a reaction, didn't ask for acknowledgement, and didn't wait for permission. She simply turned her face, slow, deliberate, toward the one eye in the room that could not blink, the studio camera. It caught her full frame now, steady, framed by the pale light of the set and the dark velvet hush that had fallen over everything. Her expression didn't waver. There was no triumph in her eyes, no lingering anger, no fatigue. Only something far harder to define, conviction tempered by sorrow. She spoke not to defend herself, not to explain, but to place a weight directly on the conscience of the nation. "I didn't come here to defend my name," she said, her voice low but resolute, carrying through the silence like a ripple across still water. "I came to ask a question." She didn't raise her hand. She didn't gesture to the damning evidence still on the table. She didn't need to. That work was done. This wasn't about maps or money or metadata anymore. This was about something more dangerous, more essential. The threshold at which people stop caring to know what's true. Her eyes didn't leave the lens. "I ask it of you, Joy," she said. "But more than that, I ask it of everyone watching." A pause. No camera angle shifted. No lights flashed. The world seemed to hold its breath. "When the truth," she continued, and each syllable fell like a stone into deep water, "no longer turns a prophet, who will still have the courage to hold it?" The words didn't echo. They absorbed. They didn't provoke cheers or groans. They dismantled pretense. It was the kind of question that didn't call for an answer, because it already knew most people wouldn't offer one. It was too close, too raw, too revealing. Around her, the set of The View might as well have disappeared. There was no laughter, no paper rustling, no technician shifting in his seat. Joy Behar didn't flinch, didn't lift her head. Her face, once animated by challenge and command, now seemed carved in stillness, like someone who had just been shown a reflection they didn't recognize and weren't ready to face. The audience, moments ago so responsive, had turned to stone. Some had their hands clasped near their chins. Others sat frozen mid-breath. A few blinked as if trying to process the fact that this wasn't a segment. This was a line they couldn't scroll past, a truth they couldn't mute. The camera held on Jasmine's face, longer than a television camera is supposed to linger. It captured not defiance, but something rarer. Serenity in the midst of moral fire. A quiet woman who had just stood up, not with rage, but with facts and a question sharp enough to cut through any studio, any screen, any narrative. Still, no one spoke. Joy's cue cards lay on the desk in front of her, but her hands didn't touch them. Her shoulders had drawn slightly inward, not out of embarrassment, but gravity. The kind that comes when you realize the machine you've operated might have had more consequence than you ever admitted. She didn't apologize, she didn't argue, but she didn't look up either. And for once, there was no rescue, no producer shouting into an earpiece, no commercial break conveniently timed, no segment transition, just silence, thick, uncuttable. The kind of silence that only follows a question you can't answer without first confronting yourself. And in that frozen stillness, Jasmine Crockett remained motionless. She didn't blink. She didn't move. Because the question had been asked, and this time no one could pretend they didn't hear it. Jasmine's final question had landed not like a soundbite, but like a stone dropped into still water, its ripples growing, distorting reflections, unsettling everything they touched. By the time the sun rose the next morning, those ripples had become waves. The morning after the broadcast, a stillness hung in newsrooms like the air before a storm breaks. But it wasn't fear, it was recalibration. Editors stared at headlines already cued the night before, ones that now felt obsolete. The narrative had flipped, and not with a shout, not with outrage, but with something far more disarming, quiet, methodical truth. Before 7 a.m., both right-wing outlets and center-left publications had published breaking banners with an almost identical tone, unusual in an era where words were usually weapons. The titles didn't scream scandal. They observed a shift. Crockett turns the table, with composure and cold, hard data. It wasn't just coverage, it was reverence. Cable news hosts who had, until yesterday, referred to Jasmine with skepticism, now spoke her name with a kind of wary respect. Whether you agree with her politics or not, one anchor admitted on air, you don't walk into a trap like that and walk out controlling the narrative unless you came armed with more than ego. Viewers, especially older ones, veterans of decades of political theater, reacted in a way no one expected. They weren't moved by her defense. They were moved by her discipline. Across comments sections and community pages, the same phrase echoed again and again, like a shared revelation. She didn't yell. She didn't cry. She didn't posture. She laid the evidence down on the table and let it speak. In a political climate addicted to noise, Jasmine's restraint had done something extraordinary. It had quieted the room, and for a demographic often weary of spin and spectacle, her approach was more than impressive. It was honorable. A retired Vietnam veteran posted on his local blog, "For once, someone walked into the fire and didn't make it about themselves. She didn't defend her brand, she defended the truth." That's leadership. But perhaps the most piercing reaction came from a single tweet, 12 words, no hashtags, no emojis. Posted by a former FBI field supervisor with a reputation for blunt analysis, it went viral before noon. Crockett just did what a dozen congressional hearings never could. She made the media look in the mirror. It wasn't hyperbole, it was a confession. And it hit harder because it came not from her supporters, but from the skeptics. Those trained not to be impressed and who understood what it meant to walk the tightrope between truth and politics without falling into performance. Behind closed doors, producers at The View met in a room with the blinds drawn, speaking not in anger, but in murmurs. There was no plan yet for how to follow it up. No crisis strategy, because this wasn't backlash, it was consequence. The tape was being replayed not because it was scandalous, but because it had shifted the axis of the conversation. Viewers weren't just talking about Jasmine. They were talking about the system, the machinery of perception, the loopholes of narrative construction, the blind spots they now realized they had helped maintain. Journalists and legacy media outlets began reviewing their internal vetting processes. Several op-ed writers who had previously been critical of Crockett issued addendums to their pieces. Not retractions, but acknowledgments. One of them wrote, "I mistook silence for guilt, but what I saw yesterday was someone who understood that facts age better than outrage." Professors at journalism schools began adapting clips from the segment into their lectures. A professor at Northwestern University called it a landmark in political communication, not for its drama, but for its structure. Students debated the moment not just as a television event, but as a case study in institutional integrity. Even congressional aides, hardened staffers who've seen reputations crushed in real time, circulated Slack messages with links to the full uncut broadcast. "Study this," one message read. "It's how you walk into a lion's den with no armor and walk out with the floor." And Jasmine? She remained silent. No press conferences, no tweets, no post-show interviews, because she didn't need to say anything else. She had said everything that mattered, with documents, with recordings, and with one final question that still echoed across headlines, airwaves, and dining room conversations. When truth stops being profitable, who will still have the courage to hold it? It wasn't just rhetorical, it was radioactive. And as the day unfolded, it became increasingly clear. This was no longer just about Jasmine Crockett. This was about every anchor who read a teleprompter without fact-checking, every editor who chased clicks over verification, every viewer who stopped asking, "Who's behind this?" and just clicked share. Jasmine had broken through, not by burning the system down, but by calmly holding up a mirror and forcing it to see itself. And somehow, in an era built on short attention spans and sensationalism, she had done the unthinkable. She had made the truth go viral. The headlines, the applause, and the overnight analyses would eventually fade. But one thing would linger, an unspoken demand that every witness to Jasmine's stand examine not just the story, but themselves. And that demand is the human lesson at the center of it all. Truth, Jasmine's ordeal reminded the nation, is not a relic locked in archives, but a living force that demands guardianship. And those guardians are rarely the people we expect. It is not the polished anchor who wields ratings, nor the lobbyist who pulls legislative strings, but the individual who sits in the direct blast of injustice and refuses to move even an inch without verifiable evidence. Truth asks something excruciating. It asks us to stay calm while staring into the eyes of a lie built to imitate us, to tempt us, to outshout us. Jasmine, under the searing lights of live television, modeled that excruciating patience, holding the evidence steady while her reputation dangled in the jaws of public speculation. The lesson here is brutal but necessary. Courage isn't the roar of a lion. It's the decision not to blink in the face of orchestration. In a culture hooked on viral sound bites, her silence between each fact hit harder than any shouted slogan. That silence was not emptiness. It was discipline, the space where reason could breathe. The injustice she faced, being condemned on national television without verification, became the stage on which she proved that data, delivered calmly, can puncture the loudest narrative. The human takeaway is stark. If integrity is to survive our era of spectacle, it will be carried on the shoulders of those willing to endure the unbearable stillness of fact-checking before outrage. The second and perhaps sharper lesson concerns complicity, a word that seldom appears in headlines because it indicts reader and writer alike. Joy Behar's moment of reckoning illustrated that complicity rarely snarls. It often smiles, rationalizes, and speaks in benign industry jargon about content flow and segment timing. Jasmine's confrontation exposed a truth most viewers hadn't wanted to see, that the machinery of misinformation is powered as much by passive hands as by malicious architects. Every time a viewer retweets a headline without reading the article, every time an editor waves a dubious dossier through the newsroom because clicks matter more than verification, the gears grind forward. Jasmine forced that mirror upon the public. In her words, "You weren't reporting, you were distributing," held a truth no studio applause could drown out. The lesson hurts because it demands we track our own fingerprints on the conspiracy wheel. It asks, when was the last time we forwarded unverified outrage simply because it aligned with our bias? It breaks the illusion that only villains lie. Sometimes decent people simply fail to ask one more question. The injustice Jasmine faced thus becomes a caution. A society that will not pause for proof may one day trample the innocent under a stampede of its own unchecked certainty. And if we do not learn from that, we are not bystanders. We are participants. Third comes the lesson of narrative economy, how lies travel lighter than truth because they check no luggage of evidence. Data Mine's forged report needed no nuance, no footnotes, no context. It needed only the right subject line, the right host, and the right timing. In contrast, Jasmine arrived with 54 pages of verification, chain of custody audio, and a financial flowchart thicker than a thriller novel, each page a sandbag meant to hold back a tide. The imbalance reveals a grim fact. Falsehood requires speed, but truth requires stamina. Most people reach for speed because it is easier, cheaper, and instantly rewarding. Jasmine's long-form rebuttal, painstakingly sourced and calmly delivered, instructed the nation in a discipline it had forgotten. Truth is slow, but it is inexorable if you give it room. Her patience under fire resurrected an old ethic. Verify first, speak second, a sequence so alien to modern discourse that it became riveting television. The unfairness she shouldered, the demand that she prove a negative under hostile lights, teaches that the shortest distance between misinformation and belief is a straight line of emotional impulse. To break that line, one must be willing to drag a mountain of receipts onto the set and dare the world to ignore them. The cinematic tension in her hand placing each sheet on the desk was not drama, it was pedagogy. A fourth lesson glints between the lines. Money's appetite for influence and the moral erosion it leaves behind. Jasmine's diagram showed that data mine scandal was not an isolated misfire, but the visible tip of a financial iceberg extending from hedge fund boardrooms to primetime segments. Her words, "This wasn't about me, I was the test case," pointed to a chilling reality. Profit doesn't just twist facts, it mass produces them. The human significance lies here. If information can be priced, truth will be underbid unless ordinary citizens police the marketplace with critical thought. Jasmine's calm exposure of the Horizon Citadel ABC nexus pierced the comfortable myth that media bias is merely ideological. Often it is financial, systemic, and coded as routine business practice. The injustice she endured thus underscores a collective duty. Transparency is not a luxury. It is the barricade that keeps commerce from colonizing conscience. When truth must compete with revenue, the public must become vigilant shareholders in reality itself. Fifth, and most intimate, is the lesson of personal agency. Jasmine faced a trap built on the assumption that she would react like any other headline casualty, with panic, with PR spin, with desperate deflection. Instead, she chose deliberate vulnerability, placing her faith not in viral outrage, but in a verifiable data. That choice is frightening because it removes every psychological crutch. It says, let the evidence stand and let me endure whatever follows. Viewers of all ages watched a person refuse to negotiate with fear, and in doing so, she reminded them of a terrifying freedom. They too can choose integrity over expediency. The injustice aimed at her became a proving ground for something deeply human. Courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to replace fear with compromise. That is a harrowing lesson because it leaves no room to hide behind excuses. If Jasmine could sit in the crosshairs and still insist on nuance, what excuse do we have in our daily lives when we shrink from smaller truths? The sixth lesson resides in the power of restraint. In an arena designed for sound bites, Jasmine wielded silence like a blade, allowing each fact to echo in the vacuum she created. Noise is easy. Quiet takes mastery. Her refusal to shout denied joy the chaos necessary for spectacle and forced both host and viewers to confront unvarnished reality. It demonstrated that sometimes the loudest stance is refusing to fill the air with anything but proof. The inequality she confronted, being accused in front of 8 million without prior notice, could have justified fury. Instead, Jasmine's restraint inverted the imbalance. The calmer she spoke, the more frantic the lie appeared. Audiences learned a paradoxical truth. Composure, not volume, is the keystone of credible dissent. And in a culture of escalating decibels, that realization flashed like a warning across every screen. Seventh comes the lesson of institutional self-examination. Within 24 hours, producers, journalists, and commentators were compelled to scrutinize their own processes, some for the first time in years. The viral tweet from the former FBI agent captured this pivot. She forced the media to look in the mirror. That forced reflection is humanitarian, not adversarial, because a society cannot improve if its storytellers refuse self-audit. Jasmine's stand reminded every newsroom that credibility is rented, never owned, and rent is due each time a story goes live. The injustice she unveiled serves as a perpetual invoice. When trust is eroded, the cost is paid in civic disengagement and democratic fracture. The tension becomes epic when we realize that invoice lands on every desk. Reader, reporter, legislator, a collective bill for vigilance. Eighth, the episode teaches the ethics of consumption. The older demographic that voiced admiration did so because they recognized a dwindling value. Respect for evidence. Their praise, she didn't scream, she just laid out proof, wasn't about temperament alone. It was a lament that society had traded discernment for entertainment. Jasmine's steady hand placing documents on a table became a ritual, almost liturgical, reminding viewers that citizenship is an intellectual practice, not a tribal reflex. The unfairness she faced, having to earn back her own presumption of innocence, serves as a warning. The next victim of viral injustice might not come as prepared. If audiences remain passive, the machinery will keep spinning, grinding reputations into content. The lesson, then, is as brutal as it is simple. Passive viewership is consent to manipulation. Finally, the ninth lesson is hope wrapped in responsibility. Jasmine proved that one person, armed with truth and discipline, can pivot a national narrative, at least for a day. That should inspire, but also burden, because it reveals how fragile truth is if it relies on individual heroics. The injustice she faced is ongoing. Systems seldom dismantle themselves overnight. But her stand carved a path. It calls on every viewer, reader, and bystander to shoulder a fragment of the duty she carried alone under studio lights. The closing morale is cinematic yet sober. The fight for truth isn't a single showdown, it's a relay, and each of us holds the baton for one short stretch. Jasmine's question, who will keep the truth when it stops paying dividends, echoes as both indictment and invitation. The next person who answers it could change everything or lose everything trying. That admission is the truest, hardest, most necessary human lesson of all. Jasmine's story didn't end with applause or headlines. It began with a challenge. Because what she exposed wasn't just a media failure, it was a mirror. And now that mirror is pointed squarely at us. This isn't just about Jasmine Crockett. This is about every time a lie wins because the truth arrived late and alone. It's about every inbox that receives a leak and hits share before asking, is this real? It's about every network that runs a sensational segment for ratings and every viewer who nods along without asking one hard question. Jasmine didn't just defend herself. She demonstrated the cost of apathy. She showed that silence isn't neutrality, it's permission. So if you're watching this, reading this, remembering this, know that your next click, your next comment, your next instinct to believe or doubt, it matters. This is a call not to react faster, but to think deeper. Because the next target won't have a binder full of documents or a 2-minute recording that makes the truth undeniable. And next time, the lie may win. We don't need a million Jasmines. We need one person in every room who's willing to ask, where did this come from? One producer who says, we don't run this unless it's verified. One teacher who says, let's look at the source. One citizen who says, I won't forward that unless I know it's true. This story was a political scandal, but the solution isn't political. It's cultural. It's personal. You don't need a platform to stand up for the truth. You need a spine, a standard, and the willingness to be hated for asking questions that should have been asked from the start. Jasmine took the hit so we wouldn't have to next time. Don't let that sacrifice be wasted. So here it is, plain and urgent. Demand transparency from your media, your leaders, your peers? Speak less quickly, but with more clarity. Read past the headline. Question before you share. And if you ever find yourself sitting where Jasmine did, under the lights, facing a storm of accusation, remember that calm is not weakness. Proof is not drama. And truth, when spoken clearly enough, can shatter any script written to erase you. You don't have to be perfect to fight back. You just have to be prepared. And if you aren't yet, start now. Because the next story they try to write without facts might be about you. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference. On a national stage built for laughs, one woman turned satire into a battlefield. Jasmine Crockett walked into Stephen Colbert's arena, surrounded by 400 hostile audience members, as he tried to reduce her to a punchline, painting her as just another angry voice to amuse the crowd. But within minutes, she shattered the illusion, dropping irrefutable data, invoking raw, real-world tragedy, and delivering a single line that turned applause into paralyzed silence. When mockery is used to bury the truth, what happens when the truth refuses to stay buried? Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The camera swept across the studio, capturing every blinding spotlight and polished surface of the late show stage. It looked more like a battlefield than a comedy set tonight. Rows of sharply dressed liberal-leaning audience members leaned forward in their seats, buzzing with the smug anticipation of a ritual they'd seen before. A conservative walking into the lion's den, about to be shredded by Stephen Colbert's wit. The orchestra played a jazzy flourish as the announcer's voice boomed, "Please welcome Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett." The applause was scattered, hesitant. Some clapped out of politeness, others crossed their arms. And though no one booed, the temperature in the room dropped several degrees. Jasmine emerged from behind the curtain, wearing a sleek midnight blue blazer that caught the light like armor. Her heels clicked with deliberate force as she crossed the stage, chin high, flanked by invisible tension. The spotlight hit her like a sniper's scope, but she didn't blink. Colbert stood, arms open like a showman playing a trap door, and gestured toward her seat. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, voice dripping with irony, "we are honored tonight to be joined by a congresswoman who's made headlines, not for legislation, but for interrupting more hearings than she's passed bills." The audience exploded with laughter. Laughter with teeth, the kind that doesn't laugh with you. It laughs at you. Jasmine walked to her chair without so much as a glance toward the crowd, not a flicker of discomfort. She had heard worse in silence, in back rooms, in hearings where her microphone was cut off mid-sentence. As she sat down, she met Colbert's gaze with the stillness of someone who had already seen the punch coming before he threw it. She didn't react to the applause or the insult. She reacted to the power dynamics. She wasn't here for permission to speak. She was here to break the script. The laughter from the crowd hadn't fully faded when Colbert reached for his next weapon. Words dressed as jokes, polished like glass shards. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. His power wasn't volume. It was precision. He shifted in his chair, cocked his head slightly, and let his voice curl like smoke. "Congresswoman," he said in the tone of someone about to offer a compliment he had no intention of meaning, "help me out here. You say you represent working-class Americans. You talk about justice reform and institutional bias and systemic inequality. Big words, big claims. But let's be honest for a second." He smiled with the full confidence of someone who knew the crowd was already on his side. "When you're out there calling the entire system broken, do you think you're helping people understand? Or just helping them stay angry?" A few claps, some snickering. Then, with the timing of a seasoned performer, he drove the blade. "Because some folks out there might hear you and wonder if you're speaking for them, or for the people who still think the earth is flat." The studio cracked open with laughter, short, sharp, and collective. It was the kind of laugh that didn't need context, and it only needed one thing: a target. Jasmine didn't move, Not a twitch, not a blink. Her hands remained folded loosely in her lap, her back straight, posture dignified. But her silence wasn't submission. It was strategy. The kind of silence that grew up knowing that if you showed even a flicker of offense, they'd claim you were too emotional. So she didn't react. She studied. Colbert kept going, emboldened. Look, I get it. The justice system needs improvement. But there's a difference between reform and rebellion, right? You talk about tearing down structures, but what exactly are you building in their place? He turned to the audience theatrically. I mean, I like bridges, not bonfires. More laughter, applause. Jasmine slowly turned her head toward him. Her eyes were quiet, not cold, not angry, just focused in a way that made the air feel suddenly thinner. She waited a second longer than comfortable. Then she inhaled slowly through her nose and finally spoke, her voice calm as granite. You're very good at that, Stephen. He raised an eyebrow. At what? At turning real pain into punchlines. The studio didn't laugh. It didn't need to. Her words didn't ask for that. She continued, and you're not the first. You're part of a long tradition of hosts, writers, commentators who treat lived experiences like raw material, cut, shaped, and fitted for a segment. She leaned slightly forward, but her voice never rose. But I didn't come here to play supporting actress in a satire about my own reality. A ripple moved through the audience, something between discomfort and awe. Colbert opened his mouth, but nothing came out. For once, he wasn't sure if the next line would land or implode. Jasmine let the silence sit. She let it breathe. You ask if I'm helping people understand or stay angry? She said, voice edged with steel now. Stephen, when someone's house is on fire, they don't need understanding. They need someone to admit there's a fire. She didn't blink as she said it. She didn't stammer. Every syllable landed like a footstep across a landmine field someone else had laid. Her tone wasn't defensive, it was surgical. You brought me on your show, she continued, and the first question you throw is if I speak for flat earthers. Her voice dropped just slightly. You could have asked about sentencing disparity. You could have asked about communities that have 0 public defenders and 30 prosecutors. You could have asked about how zip codes still determine life expectancy. But no, you chose flat earth. Now it was Colbert who froze. Not theatrically, but genuinely. It was a brief, flickering beat where the rhythm of his show, so practiced, so reliable, missed a step. The cards in his hand suddenly seemed too flimsy to hold. Jasmine turned briefly to the audience, her eyes moving from face to face with something just short of confrontation. You laughed. That's fine. I expected that. But I wonder, when's the last time anyone laughed with you when it was your reality being mocked? No one moved. She returned her gaze to Colbert. You ask what I'm building in place of the broken system, she said. I'm trying to build a country where my niece doesn't have to memorize how to behave in front of a badge, where a mother doesn't have to outlive her son by 20 years because the trauma of growing up black in America aged his heart faster than his body. Now the air was dry, still. Even the camera operators were holding their breath, unsure whether to zoom or stay wide. The control room hesitated to cut to commercial, worried it might look like censorship. Colbert smiled thinly, nervously. Well, he said, you're certainly not pulling any punches. Jasmine nodded. I didn't come here to spar. I came here to speak. If that feels like a punch, maybe it's time to ask why. It was the kind of moment television doesn't prepare for, because it can't be rehearsed. There was no applause sign blinking above the audience's heads now. There was only silence. Raw, ragged, real. Colbert glanced down at his notes. They looked different now, smaller, less clever. Jasmine sat back, still calm, still unshaken. Her voice had not once broken, but everything else in the room had. The studio hadn't yet exhaled from Jasmine's last answer, when Colbert adjusted in his seat with the faintest hint of unease. He tapped the edge of his cue cards against his knee, glanced toward the camera, then pivoted his body toward her with rehearsed casualness. But the shift in tone was unmistakable, cooler, controlled. His words came now with a calculated rhythm, not the flamboyant mockery of before, but something more deliberate. "Let's take it a little deeper, Congresswoman," he said, his voice calm but laced with condescension. "You've said publicly that America's healthcare system is racially biased. You've claimed the legal system, judges, prosecutors, even first responders, treat people differently based on their skin color." His eyebrows lifted as he spoke, feigning curiosity. "I mean, do you really believe that? That the system is so broken it sees you as less human before you've even said a word?" The audience stirred. A few shifted in their seats. The tone of this question wasn't built for laughter. It was bait for contradiction, and it was sharp. He smiled thinly, then pressed again. "I'm just asking, because when you say things like that, some people hear it and think you're accusing the entire medical and legal profession of being racist. That's a heavy charge. Are you really standing by it?" The lights above snapped brighter, subtly but deliberately, a visual cue the control room didn't announce out loud, but the effect was surgical. The glow pulled over Jasmine like an interrogation lamp. It framed her, boxed her in. One woman surrounded by a machine that didn't need to shout to assert power. It just turned up the heat and waited for her to sweat. The camera zoomed, not fast but slow enough to feel invasive. Her face was now the only story on screen. She didn't flinch. But something behind her eyes shifted. Some quiet gate opening inward. She looked at Colbert, then slowly, methodically, turned her head to face the audience. Her hands were still folded neatly in her lap, but her presence had changed. It wasn't just composure anymore. It was lived weight, cold and ancient and personal. Her voice, when it came, wasn't angry. It was something deeper, wounded but not weak. "You want to know if I believe the system is rigged?" she said, eyes scanning the crowd. "I don't believe it. I know it." The audience didn't breathe, not audibly. "I know it because I once walked into an ER in Dallas with stabbing chest pain, difficulty breathing, and pressure that felt like an elephant sitting on my ribs." She paused. "The nurse looked at me, didn't run labs, didn't order scans, and told me it was anxiety. She said, 'Try to relax. You'll feel better in the morning.'" Her jaw tightened. The lighting caught the faintest shimmer in her eyes, not from tears, but from holding them back. "I wasn't anxious," she continued. "I had a partially collapsed lung. The lower left lobe was closing in on itself, and my oxygen was dropping. 2 more days like that, and I might not be sitting here." Colbert didn't speak. The audience was locked in. "They didn't miss it because they were bad people," she added, now turning back to face him. "They missed it because I didn't fit the default patient in their training manual. Because when Black women say they're in pain, we're seen as exaggerating, or dramatic, or angry." Her voice sharpened, but never rose. "I've been called all three, not in private. In clinical notes." A few gasps flickered through the audience like wind across dry leaves. Colbert's smile had vanished. He leaned back slightly, not in defense, but in realization. This wasn't punditry. This was testimony. "I was lucky," Jasmine said, sitting straighter. "I had a friend who made me go back, who drove me to a different hospital, who didn't take 'you're fine' as an answer." She took a breath, long and steady, then delivered the line like a verdict. "I came close to dying because a trained medical professional looked at my skin, my gender, and my calm voice, and decided I wasn't worth investigating." That hit harder than any insult. It echoed. She let the silence sit. Then finally she looked at Colbert with a gaze that didn't blink. "So when you ask if I believe racism exists in the system, what you're really asking is whether I trust what almost killed me." She leaned forward just enough to compress the space between them. "And when you turn that story into a question for ratings," she said, almost whispering, "you're not starting a dialogue. You're protecting a delusion." The crowd remained frozen. Even the cameras seemed to hesitate, unsure whether to zoom in closer or back off entirely. Jasmine sat back, collected, composed, and utterly untouchable. She had walked straight into the teeth of the moment, and now they weren't sure who had bitten who. The air was already heavy. Jasmine had just made the studio face something they weren't prepared to see. Pain that didn't fit the punchline. But Colbert wasn't ready to give up control. His smile returned, this time smaller, tighter. He shuffled his cards again. But this time he wasn't looking down at them. He was watching her. "Okay," he said slowly, voice softer now, as if trying to guide the energy back into familiar territory. "Let's pivot a little. I want to ask you about someone you've shared a stage with recently. Senator Langford." The name alone shifted the room. He's, let's say, not exactly a moderate. The guy once called protesters domestic threats on live television. He's pushed legislation to limit press freedom and famously said America needs more prisons, not more programs. A lot of people would call him a symbol of the new far-right populist wave. And you? Colbert leaned back with a faux casual gesture. You were seen standing right next to him, smiling. That doesn't bother you? Being linked to that kind of extremism? The question was framed to trap, not explore. It was a tactic. Take a controversial figure, attach her to him by proximity, and watch her squirm. The crowd murmured, some leaning in, others crossing their arms. Everyone was waiting to see if she'd deny, distance, or fold. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't lean forward or back. Instead, she tilted her head ever so slightly, eyes narrowing, not in anger, but in calculation. Her body didn't move, but her presence did. The temperature shifted again. She replied slowly, "Stephen, are we really talking about Senator Langford right now?" The way she said it stopped the room cold. There was no sarcasm, no defensiveness, just clarity. "Or are you bringing him up?" she continued, voice steady as a steel beam. "Because it's easier to talk about him than to talk about Senator Whitmore?" That name dropped like glass on concrete. The room hushed instantly. A few nervous laughs tried to escape, but they died in people's throats. Colbert blinked. For the first time tonight, he didn't have a comeback ready. Jasmine didn't wait for permission to continue. "It's interesting, Stephen. Every time someone like me raises questions about who holds power, real power, someone like you brings up the loudest voice on the fringe. A decoy, a distraction." Her tone was calm, but her words burned. "Langford says wild things on TV. He's easy to mock, easy to point at and say, 'That's the problem.'" She shifted in her seat for the first time, subtle but deliberate. "But you and I both know he's not the one crafting the policy behind closed doors. He's not the one signing off on surveillance budgets. He's not the one meeting quietly with defense contractors while communities like mine can't get clean water." Colbert's smile faded entirely now. He sat perfectly still. "But Senator Whitmore," Jasmine said, her voice cooling to something sharper, "she's not loud. She's not chaotic. She doesn't go viral for shouting. She gets praised for being measured, for being reasonable. Meanwhile, she votes to expand federal police powers. She sits on corporate boards that profit from private detention centers. She's passed laws that put thousands of young black men behind bars for nonviolent offenses, while giving speeches about unity." The room was dead quiet. Colbert tried to shift in his seat, but he couldn't find the right rhythm. The energy had left his hands. It was in hers now. "So you want to ask me why I was seen near someone controversial?" Jasmine asked. "Fine, ask it. But let's also ask why no one on this stage, no one in this room, has asked Whitmore about the power she holds right now." She leaned forward, just a little, just enough. "Why is it that when I stand next to someone, it's a scandal, but when she signs a bill that devastates an entire community, it's called policy?" She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "That's the game, Stephen. I know it. You know it. Distract people with outrage over association, so they don't look too closely at the ones who smile while doing damage quietly." The audience said nothing. Even the cameramen were still. Colbert opened his mouth, then closed it again. For the first time that night, his timing was gone. And for the first time that night, Jasmine wasn't defending herself. She was defending truth. The silence between them stretched, but Jasmine didn't rush to fill it. Instead, she moved with calm precision, reaching down beside her chair and lifting a slim, dark leather folder onto her lap. It made no sound, but its presence landed like a declaration. She didn't fumble. She didn't hesitate. With practiced fingers, she unzipped the folder and flipped it open, revealing a crisp stack of printed documents, charts, bar graphs, raw figures, and footnotes with real names, real years, and real suffering. The studio lights caught the slight reflection off the glossy paper, making them shimmer in front of the audience like evidence presented under oath. For the first time that evening, Jasmine wasn't just answering, she was prosecuting. "You want to talk about values?" she said softly, not looking up yet. "You want to talk about credibility? About who really stands on principle?" She lifted the top page and held it up, not to Colbert, but to the camera. A bar graph, stark red lines. No need for dramatic fonts. The numbers told their own story. This chart tracks the loss of health insurance coverage in working-class districts from 2017 to 2023, particularly in states where federal subsidies were slashed under the so-called streamlining efforts. You personally applauded on this very show. Colbert didn't respond immediately. His expression was neutral, measured, but his body shifted in the chair. Just slightly. A tell. She continued, voice steady and factual. "Do you remember what you said?" "I do. You joked that maybe if folks have to pay more out of pocket, they'll stop going to the ER for stubbed toes." That's a quote from you. November 14th, 2019. A few murmurs stirred through the audience. They weren't laughing now. Jasmine flipped to the second sheet. This one had colored overlays across a U.S. map. These are the counties where those policies hit hardest. Places where thousands lost access to essential care. Not luxury, essential care. Chemotherapy, diabetes treatment, prenatal screenings. Gone. She laid that sheet down, carefully aligned with the first. Then she picked up the third, a line graph trending sharply upward. Medical bankruptcies. You made a segment about healthcare bureaucracy and called it government bloat. The same year, personal bankruptcies from medical debt jumped 23% in underinsured populations. That's not bloat, Stephen. That's blood. The silence in the room shifted. No longer awkward. Now heavy, weighted with realization. Jasmine looked out, not just at Colbert, but beyond him, beyond the cameras. "Do you know what it's like to sit across from a single mother who has to choose between insulin for her child and rent? And then watch her blamed for poor decision-making on national television by people who've never had to choose between survival and shame?" No one in the room moved. Not the audience, not the crew, not Colbert. "I represent people who were already holding on by a thread," she said, lowering the documents now and stacking them calmly. "And when the policies you celebrated sliced through that thread, it wasn't abstract. It was immediate. It was brutal. And it was deadly." The lights didn't dim, but somehow the stage felt darker. Jasmine's voice didn't shake. She wasn't emotional in the way people expected. No fury, no raised pitch. Just the weight of someone carrying more names in her memory than most people carry in their contacts. "You didn't lose coverage, Stephen. Your premiums didn't spike. Your child didn't sit in a free clinic hallway for 6 hours with a ruptured appendix because the urgent care centers had shut down. But mine did. My district did. And you turned that into late-night content." The audience was frozen. A few heads bowed slightly. A middle-aged woman in the second row blinked rapidly. A man in a sports coat rubbed his knuckles together, visibly unsettled. Jasmine leaned back in her chair, eyes still locked on her host. "You want to talk about ethics?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "This is what your kind of ethics created." She didn't point. She didn't raise a finger. She didn't need to. The papers on the desk, silent, clinical, undeniable, spoke louder than applause ever could. The silence around the document still hung in the air, thick as velvet. Jasmine's voice had landed like a final note in a courtroom, but Colbert wasn't ready to concede. His show wasn't built for silence. He leaned forward slightly, hands now clasped together, and adopted the careful tone of someone stepping into sensitive terrain while still aiming to land a punch. "Okay," he said, his voice lowered, thoughtful, but lined with a rehearsed edge. "You've made your point. But some people watching tonight might say, wait a second, didn't Congresswoman Crockett once defend the police using data that didn't tell the whole story?" He glanced at his notes, casually flipping a card. "There was that time 2 years ago. You cited a drop in arrest rates as evidence of improved community trust. But what about the fact that the same district saw a spike in unreported crime? Critics called it misleading, cherry-picked, designed to make law enforcement look good. He said it with his trademark lightness, but there was weight behind the words, the kind meant to shake public trust, to frame her as a contradiction. The crowd reacted on cue, a few nods, soft murmurs, a ripple of shifting in seats. It was the kind of accusation that didn't need to be proven. It just needed to be planted. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't shake her head or interrupt. Instead, she slowly reached into the side of her folder, pulled out a slim black remote, and pressed a button beneath the desk. Behind them, the studio's massive wall screen flickered to life. No sound at first, just the unmistakable frozen frame of the Late Show from 3 years earlier. Colbert at his desk, eyes wide, mid-joke. The video rolled. There he was, laughing as he delivered a bit about a man in Cleveland mistaken for a robbery suspect. Tall, hoodie, and suspicious of mayonnaise, Colbert had joked as the audience roared in the clip. And by suspicious, I mean black. The line hit. It had hit then too. Drawn laughs, applause, a confident pivot into a quip about suburban paranoia and 911 overuse. But in the silence of tonight's studio, the joke didn't land. It recoiled. The clip ended, and the screen went black. Jasmine looked at Colbert. Her voice was even. Sharp. You want to question how I use numbers? Fine. But let's also question what you've used for laughter. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. Because that wasn't satire, she said. That was a real arrest. A real man on his knees in front of his kids, handcuffed for looking like someone else. He was innocent, and you made it a segment. The audience sat motionless. The silence wasn't polite, it was stricken. You talk about misleading context, Jasmine continued. But what context is there, Stephen, when a joke turns someone's trauma into your studio's applause line? Her gaze didn't soften. Her shoulders didn't drop. I didn't come here to win a debate, she said, but I won't sit still while you throw around the word manipulation from behind a desk that's polished with the pain of people like me. Colbert's face remained neutral, but his eyes had lost their smirk. Jasmine leaned forward slightly, her voice no longer cutting, but cold, surgical. Saying something cruel with a smile doesn't make it satire. It just makes it more comfortable for people to ignore what's actually broken. She paused, letting the words settle into every uncomfortable corner of the room. Let me be very clear, she said finally. I stand by my data because it came from communities. Yours came from a punchline. She sat back, and the studio for once didn't know who to look at. The host, cornered in his own arena, or the woman who had just turned his show into a courtroom and made the jury stare at their own complicity. The weight of the previous exchange hadn't lifted. It had thickened. The audience wasn't leaning forward anymore. They were pinned to their seats. Colbert had lost the rhythm, and he knew it. The air held that distinct pressure, the kind you feel in a courtroom before a verdict, in a hospital waiting room before the news. Jasmine could have stopped. She had already drawn blood with truth, exposed the polished cruelty that hides behind satire. But she wasn't done, because facts alone don't move a nation, voices do. Her hands moved slowly. No dramatics, no flair. Just deliberate motion, like she was opening a wound that demanded to be seen. From the inner flap of her folder, she drew out a small voice recorder, plain, white, clinical. She held it for a moment in her palm, as if feeling the weight of the life stored inside it. Then she set it gently on the desk between them. It was a line in the sand, and Colbert instinctively leaned back. I brought something you don't have, she said quietly, her voice lower than before, but infinitely more dangerous. Not a joke, not a clip, not applause. I brought a truth that didn't survive your headlines. She clicked play. The studio lights seemed to dim on their own, or maybe it was just the shift in the room's oxygen. A woman's voice came through, raw, trembling, layered with heartbreak that had no time to heal. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't staged, it was real, too real. They told me he was faking, the voice began. Not crying, not shouting, just surviving. My son, I said he was struggling to breathe. They said he was overreacting, said he was calm, that he didn't look like someone dying. The voice broke slightly. The audio hissed faintly. The silence in the studio became absolute. I asked them to move. They wouldn't. By the time the EMT checked his pulse, his lips were blue. They still told me he just needed rest. He died 37 minutes later. A choked breath came through the speaker. Then nothing. The clip ended, but the room didn't restart. No one moved. No one breathed. The silence wasn't empty. It was a scream, choked in the throats of hundreds. Jasmine didn't look at the camera. She didn't look at Colbert. Her eyes stayed fixed on the recorder. She was a mother from Detroit, she said softly. Her son's name was Marcus, 17, black, honors student, asthmatic. He died in a hallway because his pain wasn't considered urgent enough by a system built not to see him. Her voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. She called me after the funeral, said no one believed her. Not the doctors, not the press, not even the social worker who filed the death report. But I did. She turned slowly toward Colbert now, her expression unreadable, her words carved from something ancient and bitter. You talk about facts, Stephen, about data, about principles, but I carry names, I carry recordings, I carry the voices your audience doesn't hear, because they aren't entertaining enough to make it into a monologue. The silence was now suffocating. You think the show is about politics? I'm not here for politics. I'm here for the ones who never made it on time. She gestured toward the recorder, small still, but heavy enough to bend the studio in half. This, she said, is the sound of what you've never had to live through. And until you do, maybe ask fewer questions about who's too angry and more about why we're still mourning. Her voice didn't crack, but 1,000 hearts in that room just did. And for the first time all night, not even the cameras dared move. The last words of the mother's recording still echoed in the minds of everyone in the room, long after the audio itself had gone silent. It wasn't just the sound that haunted, it was the space left behind, the empty ache between syllables, the unmistakable truth that no monologue, no commercial break, no clever pivot could erase what had just been laid bare on national television. For the first time all night, the power didn't belong to the host. It belonged to the woman who had dared to bring grief into a space designed for applause. Colbert shifted in his chair, subtly at first, then more noticeably as he cleared his throat, eyes darting toward the stage manager just off camera. The glow of the cue monitor blinked quietly, the red light urging him to rap. His fingers fidgeted with the edge of his stack of cards, now useless, and when he finally spoke, the strength that usually wrapped his voice was missing. Well, he muttered, forcing a laugh so light it vanished the moment it touched the air. This has been intense, important no doubt, but, we're actually out of time. He trailed off. Even the apology wasn't complete. The words were an escape rope he wasn't sure would hold. And in that moment, he realized the audience wasn't coming with him. They weren't laughing. They weren't nodding. They weren't ready to move on. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't sigh. She simply watched him, calm, composed, unshaken. Then she turned her head slowly toward the audience, and that's when she smiled. It wasn't smug. It wasn't triumphant. It was precise. The kind of smile born not of victory, but of certainty. A woman who had been dismissed 1,000 times and still found her voice intact. A woman who understood that sometimes the truth doesn't need a microphone. It just needs someone who refuses to be interrupted. Her tone was quiet but unwavering. I think your audience, she said, letting her words settle like a weight on the studio floor, can give 2 more minutes to something more real than applause. No one moved. Not the host. Not the cameras. Not the carefully stage-managed world that had, until that very moment, believed it was in control. Even the blinking red light on the cue monitor seemed to hesitate. Jasmine leaned back slightly in her seat, hands still folded, not begging, not asking, simply continuing. The authority in her voice didn't come from volume. It came from presence, from experience, from loss. And as the seconds stretched into something more profound, it became painfully clear that for the first time all night, Colbert couldn't end the show, because the show wasn't his anymore. Not while truth was still speaking. The stillness in the studio had shifted from shock to something closer to reverence. The energy didn't belong to the show anymore. It belonged to the truth hanging between them, in the air, in the weight of what had already been said. Jasmine let that silence stretch just long enough to become sacred. And then, with a breath barely audible, she reached back into her folder for something heavier than a quote or a quip. She pulled out 3 stapled pages, bland, bureaucratic, yet terrifying. The kind of government document that never makes headlines but decides who suffers. The kind of data that lives in footnotes while people live with the consequences. She didn't raise her voice. She raised the paper. "You want to know what real imbalance looks like?" she asked, her tone flat but piercing. "It's not just about who gets airtime or whose voice is loudest. It's about who gets funded and who gets forgotten." She unfolded the first page, exposing it to the camera without theatrics. Just the bare truth. Her finger tapped the top line. "This is a line-by-line reduction in federal public benefit spending between 2016 and 2023. It's all here. Housing assistance, down 31.2%, SNAP reductions affecting 1.6 million households, emergency Medicaid waivers, revoked in 19 states during the peak of a respiratory pandemic." She flipped to the second page, her voice tightening, not with anger, but with precision, with lived experience. "Meanwhile, here's what went up during the same period. Federal and state subsidies for high-budget entertainment projects, TV shows, streaming giants, film festivals, PR contracts for government messaging. In one fiscal year, the Department of Commerce approved $84 million for domestic media partnerships, while cutting youth nutrition grants in 2/3 of inner-city districts." She laid the papers flat across the desk now, perfectly aligned, like evidence before a jury. And in a way they were. She turned to Colbert, expression unreadable, gaze sharp. "You talk about politics like it's performance, like dysfunction is just another comedy genre. But this isn't satire, Stephen. This is suffering measured in decimal points." Her voice dropped an octave. "While you joke about who won the week, I come from places where people pray not to lose their heat, where schools no longer serve lunch on Fridays and landlords turn off water without warning, where the mail doesn't bring relief, it brings denial letters. And when it does, the comedians are silent. The studio, which once fed off rhythm and repartee, had become a courtroom of conscience. I'm not here to entertain. I'm here to remind you that behind every punchline about Congress, there's a woman who didn't get her insulin this month, a child whose coat is a pillow, a father who hides the eviction notice until the lights go out." She paused. "Let that land," then held up the final page, blank except for one line circled in red ink. "Unspent emergency funds reclassified for media development." She stared at it a moment. "Do you know what that means, Stephen?" she asked, quieter now. "It means money meant to help people survive was rerouted to help people look good." She looked up again, directly into the camera. "And while you mock the absurdity of it all, millions live in the punchline." She placed the pages down, neatly, precisely, and sat back. She hadn't raised her voice once, but the silence that followed could have cracked stone. The documents lay untouched, splayed across the desk like an indictment. But it wasn't just ink and numbers that had silenced the room. It was the way Jasmine had made the data personal, human, real. The kind of truth you couldn't edit with laughter. Around the studio, faces were frozen mid-expression. The clappers in the back row hadn't moved. The interns at the edge of the crowd had lowered their iPads. Somewhere in the third row, a young man, 20s, buzz-cut, denim jacket, turned slowly to look at the woman beside him. She didn't say anything, but her eyes were glossy, hands clasped tightly together. They didn't expect this. No one had. The audience had come for comedy. But this was something else entirely. Colbert shifted in his chair, not in control, but in search of footing. The silence should have been a cue, should have told him this was the moment to pause, to absorb, to listen. But instinct dies hard, especially for someone who built a career on spinning discomfort into claps. He offered the room a hollow chuckle, one that never touched his eyes, and leaned forward just enough to appear present without actually engaging. "Well," he said softly, almost as if confessing rather than commenting. "That's certainly interesting." The words dropped like a stone in still water. He smiled, but even that looked unsure. A smile drawn by muscle memory, not conviction. Not one person laughed, not even the usual diehards in the front row. And then Jasmine looked up. The air changed again. "No," she said, her voice sharp but steady. "It's not interesting." She didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She didn't soften her edge to make it palatable. "This is reality, Stephen. Not a segment, not a setup, not some clever transition between commercial breaks." She straightened the papers in front of her, not because they needed it, but because she understood the power of restraint. Her poise was unnerving, precise, calm, and completely unafraid. "What you just heard, that wasn't policy theory or partisan spin. That was someone's home, someone's child, someone's death certificate, paid for by indifference and printed on recycled platitudes." Her words fell like hammer strikes, methodical and spaced, each one making space for the next. "You say it's interesting. I say it's an indictment." Colbert's smile didn't hold. It cracked slightly at the edges. Jasmine leaned forward, not aggressively, but deliberately. The energy in her voice cooled, that more than anything made the room tenser. She wasn't angry. She was resolute. "I've sat in town halls where mothers pass around photos of sons who didn't come home. I've watched voters cry in parking lots because they missed the deadline for SNAP renewals. I've walked through school gymnasiums that double as shelters. That's the reality we carry." She paused, then looked him directly in the eye. "But what do you carry?" The question wasn't loud, but it was thunderous. "You sit in a multi-million-dollar studio, surrounded by professionals paid to make your discomfort disappear in post-production. You write jokes about dysfunction, while families are rationing antibiotics in zip codes your advertisers don't even track." The crowd had stopped being an audience. They were now witnesses. And it was clear many were unsure which side of the courtroom they were sitting on. "You call this interesting?" she asked again. This is not content. This is consequence." Another pause. Another silence. No one dared interrupt. Jasmine slowly reached for the final document and slid it into her folder. Quietly, deliberately. Then she folded her hands and returned her gaze to Colbert, not with malice, but with something colder, more permanent. "This isn't about whether you agree with me, Stephen," she said. "It's about whether you see the people you've spent years pretending to speak for." The sentence hit with finality, not fury. And in that moment, the bright lights of the studio didn't feel like showbiz. They felt like exposure. A young woman in the front row wiped under her eye. Another man crossed his arms, then uncrossed them. Somewhere near the back, someone whispered, "Damn." Jasmine sat still. She didn't need to say another word. Because sometimes the most devastating thing in a room built for laughter is someone who refuses to play along. The silence hadn't moved since her last sentence. Still heavy, still charged, still hovering just beneath the rafters like thunder that refused to roll. The lights on set felt sharper now, colder, no longer stage-friendly, but surgical. The audience wasn't just watching anymore. They were listening, and more terrifying than that, for Colbert they were feeling. Jasmine remained composed, eyes steady on her host, hands folded with the discipline of someone who had learned that even breathing too hard in rooms like this could be held against her. But she wasn't finished, and she never raised her voice, not because she couldn't, but because the truth didn't need volume when it had weight. She leaned forward just slightly, her gaze still locked on Colbert, not in aggression, but in precision. "We don't have to agree," she said slowly, voice like glass under pressure. "But we do need fairness." The words were simple, uncomplicated. But in that room, they cracked like a gavel. Colbert swallowed, just once. He hadn't blinked in a while. His smile had long since collapsed into the kind of forced neutrality that looked like surrender behind the eyes. Jasmine continued. "And please," she said, her tone sharpening but never rising. Don't speak about freedom of speech if your version of it means inviting people like me just to mock us. She didn't look at the audience, but the audience looked at her. Every eye, every breath. Something was happening now and they knew it. They weren't watching a guest anymore. They were witnessing someone unmask the very stage she sat on. You don't get to hide behind satire, she added. Not when the laughter is only allowed to point in one direction. There was no anger in her delivery, just undeniable clarity. The kind that couldn't be edited out in post. The kind that got replayed on the 6 o'clock news because it left the room changed. This platform, she said, gesturing lightly to the studio around her, was built on the idea that it could challenge power. But somewhere along the line, it stopped doing that and started shielding it instead. And then she finally turned to the crowd. Not to perform, but to confront. The camera followed her slowly, panning across the faces now stripped of amusement. A young woman in a black beanie looked down at her hands, clasped tightly in her lap. A man in a blazer, previously smirking, now sat stone-faced, his jaw clenched, no longer sure if the person he came to cheer for was the person still holding the floor. No one laughed, not a sound. The camera drifted past them like it was searching for something to hold on to, some sign of comic relief. But it found none, because Jasmine had just burned the laugh track out of the room. She spoke again, her voice softer now but not gentler. "You want real freedom of speech?" she asked, gaze still on the audience. "It's when you let someone finish a thought even if it makes you uncomfortable, even if it doesn't fit your applause line, even if it reminds you that justice is louder than jokes." Her words landed like stones on glass. Colbert shifted again, tried to lift his shoulders in a gesture of neutrality, but there was nowhere left to retreat. Not intellectually, not morally. Jasmine wasn't arguing anymore. She was revealing, and that was more dangerous than any counterpoint. "There's a difference," she said, turning back to him now, "between disagreement and dismissal. One invites truth, the other buries it." She looked down briefly at the documents on the table, then back up. "I've been dismissed my whole life, by teachers, by prosecutors, by pundits who thought silence meant consent. But I learned something. When you speak clearly in rooms where you're supposed to be invisible, they call it disruptive. When you bring truth into comedy, they call it killing the vibe. But the only thing I've ever tried to kill is indifference." That sentence cut the air into fragments. And just like that, the studio felt like a courtroom again. One where the judge wasn't behind the desk, but across from it. One where the verdict wasn't spoken but felt. The camera lights dimmed, but the air in the studio didn't shift. It hung, charged and motionless, as if the room itself had forgotten how to breathe. Colbert managed to mutter something clipped and professional about an important discussion and thanked Jasmine for joining us. But it was clear to everyone watching he wasn't closing the show. She had already done that, with truth, with weight, with a finality that couldn't be followed by credits or jazz band riffs. The moment wasn't over. It was transferring, because in the seconds after the stage lights cooled and the applause sign blinked weakly overhead, the real battle, the one Colbert couldn't control, moved online, and it moved fast. Within minutes, the first clip hit Twitter, a 72-second segment from the second half of the interview, raw and unedited. Jasmine sitting straight-backed, eyes locked, voice steel-cut and low. "We don't have to agree, but don't speak about freedom of speech when your platform is built to humiliate the voices you invite." The caption read, "Crockett crushes Colbert." Finally, someone says it to his face. It took exactly 11 minutes to hit 10,000 retweets. By the half-hour mark, Crockett crushes Colbert was trending #1 nationally, then globally. Twitter's servers slowed under the weight of simultaneous uploads from different angles. Some shot illegally from inside the studio by stunned audience members, others screen captured from bootleg streams, edited in real time with bullet points and fire emojis. And then came TikTok, not with noise but with silence. The most viral clip was just 14 seconds long. No background music, no fast edits, just Jasmine's voice, calm and deliberate, beneath a dim studio light. Truth doesn't have to yell. It just has to be brave enough to speak when the whole room wants silence. The caption below read simply, She didn't flinch. Not once. The video exploded. 3 million views in under an hour. Duets, reactions, overlays of quiet tears from nurses, teachers, exhausted young mothers, watching on grainy screens from break rooms and hospital cafeterias. In Cleveland, a high school teacher played it for her civics class the next morning and watched in stunned silence as a group of normally disengaged seniors sat forward, eyebrows furrowed, no one speaking. A student finally whispered, "Why did that feel like she was talking to us?" In Houston, an Uber driver turned down his music, played the audio from the clip again, and said to his passenger, "That's the first time I've heard someone tell the truth on a comedy show." The wave wasn't partisan, it was personal. And then came CNN. The segment aired under the headline, "Crockett's combative interview sparks online firestorm." The framing was textbook. Faux neutral language laced with faint disapproval, snippets of the interview cut and re-edited out of order, followed by a panel of commentators, none of whom had been in the room, analyzing whether Jasmine's tone had been too confrontational for late-night civility. What they didn't expect was the backlash. The clip was uploaded to YouTube and ratioed into oblivion within hours. Tens of thousands of comments, most furious, some heartbroken, all laser-focused on a singular betrayal. That a woman had spoken with honesty and composure, and the media had treated her like a disruptor instead of a truth-teller. One of the most upvoted comments read, "CNN's problem isn't that they don't know what the truth is, it's that they're scared of what happens when someone tells it too clearly." And it didn't stop there. By the end of the first night, major liberal and conservative news outlets were covering it, each trying to spin it, own it, soften it, disarm it. But they couldn't, because Jasmine's words weren't just commentary, they were evidence. Clips of her exposing public benefit cuts versus entertainment subsidies were being broken down in TikTok explainers by former IRS agents. Healthcare activists were overlaying her statements about emergency room neglect with actual ER footage. Organizers in Chicago, Oakland, and Jackson were quoting her in flyers and live streams. "You don't get to talk about satire while we're burying our kids." And somewhere behind the scenes, producers at The Late Show were panicking. Emails were flying. Damage control was being drafted. Meetings were called to discuss whether to upload the full segment or a sanitized version, edited, restructured, softened with music and less of the audience silence. But the damage wasn't the segment. The damage was the absence of defense. Colbert hadn't lost a debate. He had lost the room, and the internet had seen it. The New York Times wrote an op-ed the following day. "When the audience stops laughing, what happens when late night meets real pain?" The author called the moment a rupture, noting that Crockett didn't hijack the interview. She reclaimed the stage from satire's safety net and forced everyone watching to ask whether comedy had become a weapon of deflection rather than reflection. Colbert's official account posted a brief, vague tweet that evening. "Appreciate all perspectives shared on last night's show. Always room for important dialogue." The replies were brutal. "You invited her to mock her, and she walked in holding a mirror. Say her name or say you weren't ready. Dialogue requires equal footing. You gave her a trap. She gave you the truth." Meanwhile, Jasmine had said nothing. No press releases, no threads, no retweets. She didn't need to. The silence was hers now. Because when a woman walks into a room designed to break her and instead exposes the foundation itself, she doesn't need to scream. She just needs the world to hear what she already knows. And on that night, they did. For the first time in a long time, they really did. If Twitter had lit the match and TikTok fueled the fire, academia, slow, measured, deliberate, was now watching the blaze with awe. And for once, it didn't try to contain it. In the days that followed the viral explosion, something unprecedented happened behind the doors of media schools from NYU to Berkeley. Professors rewrote their syllabi in real time. The headlines hadn't even cooled yet, but Jasmine's confrontation with Colbert was already being dissected in media ethics courses, political communication labs, and advanced journalism seminars. Not as a scandal, not as an outburst, but as a masterclass. A moment so precisely constructed, so flawlessly executed, that instructors couldn't ignore it. They weren't just analyzing what she said, they were studying how she said it, and more importantly, how it landed. The emotional current that had electrified living rooms and timelines now hummed under projectors and across classroom debates. Jasmine's voice echoed from speakers clipped to whiteboards. Truth doesn't have to yell. It just has to be brave enough to speak when the whole room wants silence. It played not as a soundbite, but as a lesson, a strategy, a turning point. At Columbia Journalism School, Professor Elaine Morris paused the clip mid-sentence and turned to her first-year cohort. "What do you see here?" she asked, not what they thought, but what they saw. A hand rose, then another, and another. "She timed it like a courtroom closing," said one student. "She didn't attack. She reframed," said another. "She baited the host into revealing his bias," said a third, quieter voice near the window. "No," Morris corrected gently. "He revealed it himself. She just left the silence long enough for everyone to notice." In the back of the room, a visiting journalist from The Guardian scribbled furiously. The board read in large red chalk, "When comedy forgets its conscience, this is how you take the mic back." And this was happening everywhere. At Northwestern, the Media Impact course opened its Thursday module with the title, Episode Crockett vs. Colbert, The Power of Prepared Truth. They analyzed her body language, her tone, the way she waited for laughter to die before landing her heaviest lines. They watched how she never raised her voice, never interrupted, never reached for applause, because she wasn't speaking to the audience in the room, she was speaking to the one outside it. And for the first time in years, classrooms were buzzing not about how to go viral, but how to hold the line when the spotlight tries to burn through you. It wasn't just communication students. Law schools began borrowing the segment as an example of applied argumentation in hostile environments. Rhetoric programs compared it to historical turning points in televised confrontation. Bobby Kennedy in Mississippi, Anita Hill's testimony, Barack Obama's 2008 Philadelphia speech. Except this time, it wasn't a man. And it wasn't a monologue. It was battlefield dialogue. And it was prepared. That's what stunned the faculty most. The detail in her data, the control in her cadence, the precision in her pushback. Jasmine hadn't walked into the lion's den with charm or cleverness. She walked in armed with evidence and the courage to force laughter to listen. At USC's Annenberg School, Professor Devin Shaw clicked to a slide showing Jasmine's printed documents on the Colbert table. The chart was visible, so were the footnotes. "She didn't just call out policy injustice," he said, circling the slide with a laser. "She brought receipts, tangible, irrefutable, inconvenient facts, live on camera with no safety net." One student raised her hand. "But how do you even prepare for something like that? That's not taught in a textbook." Professor Shaw nodded. "No, it's not, because textbooks teach how to speak. She teaches why you speak." There was a pause in the room, and then he clicked to the next slide. "This is how you change the media game, without shouting, without name-calling, and without permission." That line became a meme by midnight. In Boston, Emerson College hosted a student-led panel called Breaking the Format When Guests Rewrite the Script. The auditorium was packed. On the panel, a senior broadcast major summarized it best. Jasmine didn't fight to win the crowd. She fought to force the mirror upright, even if it shattered everything around her. Across the country, professors were no longer asking students how to craft a segment or cut a viral clip. They were asking, what do you stand for when the host mocks you? What will you say when the crowd turns on you? Will you have your facts ready or just your feelings? And quietly but undeniably, a shift began in media pedagogy. The age of quippy sound bites and staged political jabs was cracking. And Jasmine's appearance wasn't just a glitch in the system, it was a recalibration, a warning to hosts who played God with their guests, a signal to viewers numbed by laughter that some truths couldn't be digested in punchlines, and a blueprint to students who once believed justice could only be served behind podiums or in protests. Now they had proof it could also be delivered on late-night television, if you were ready and unafraid to speak while the whole room wanted you quiet. From classrooms where students once studied theory, Jasmine had become the case study. But the moment her name appeared on the crimson banner behind a Harvard lectern, it was no longer just analysis, it was recognition. Not of celebrity, but of clarity, of a voice that refused to shrink under ridicule or bow to performance. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, guest speaker, Kennedy School Forum, Equity in Media, and the Anatomy of Honest Dialogue. The line outside the hall snaked through the courtyard, past the brick arches, packed with journalism majors, political science students, and professors who hadn't seen their lecture halls this full in years. Inside, the air felt less like an academic event and more like the eve of something seismic. Jasmine didn't enter to applause. She entered to a quiet hum of anticipation, students sitting forward, pens already in hand. No teleprompter, no intro video. Just a woman who had held her ground against a juggernaut and left the nation speechless. She stood at the podium in black, understated but commanding, with the quiet confidence of someone who had already weathered the storm and knew she didn't need the wind to speak. "Let's begin with a simple premise," she said, her voice steady and direct. "The truth doesn't perform, it persists." No theatrics, no grand gestures, just measured, piercing cadence that cut through the politeness of the Ivy League chamber like a scalpel. She didn't recount the Colbert night as a victory. She dissected it as an ecosystem. How media trains the public to laugh before it thinks. How narratives are shaped by who's holding the mic and who they believe deserves to speak into it. How a woman of color is often invited not to dialogue, but to decorate the illusion of balance. "The stage was never neutral," she said flatly, "but neither am I." Heads turned, pens paused. That line would be quoted in op-eds, student blogs, and Twitter threads for weeks. She moved seamlessly between policy and narrative warfare, explaining how media framing could silence victims more efficiently than any law. She showed charts of speaking time disparities, interrupted guests by race and gender, and the subtle mechanics of laugh tracks as weapons. But more than data, she delivered challenge. "Ask yourselves," she said, her eyes scanning the audience, "who do we protect with satire, and who do we permit ourselves to mock?" The applause wasn't thunderous. It was slow, rising, thoughtful, because what she gave them wasn't entertainment. It was accountability. Later that week, she appeared on a national talk show, a glossy, polished evening segment hosted by a seasoned anchor known more for celebrity interviews than anything resembling confrontation. The topic was her Harvard lecture. The host leaned forward, clearly hoping for a juicy retelling of the Colbert encounter. "What did that night feel like for you?" he asked with a rehearsed smile. "I mean, sitting across from him, with all that tension in the room, what was going through your mind?" Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't play coy. She didn't deflect. Instead, she leaned back slightly, her hands folded in her lap like she wasn't here to defend herself, only to state what needed to be said. "I wasn't there to win an argument," she said softly, but with unmistakable firmness. "I came to make people ask themselves, what exactly are you laughing at? And why?" The host blinked. The smile froze just a half-second too long. She continued, letting the silence stretch like a stage. "Because when a woman talks about racial bias in healthcare, and the room chuckles, that's not about her. That's about us. That's about what we've normalized, what we've decided is safe to mock." The camera didn't cut away. The producers didn't insert a graphic. The moment was raw, and they knew it. Jasmine leaned forward now, voice steady as ever. "Civility doesn't mean silence. Dialogue doesn't mean deference. And freedom of speech doesn't mean freedom from consequence, especially if your job is to shape public opinion and you're doing it through laughter." Across living rooms and dorm rooms and newsroom break rooms, that clip would replay like a confession wrung out from a system that had gotten too comfortable ridiculing the inconvenient. On social media, it sparked headlines, not just a clapback. Crockett's Harvard lecture redefines media accountability. Truth doesn't perform, the soundbite that shook two coasts. Crockett calls the game, and the game can't laugh it off. But Jasmine didn't revel in any of it. She hadn't come for the applause. She had come to recalibrate what a public conversation could be, one where honesty wasn't edited for comfort and dignity wasn't sacrificed for ratings. And in doing so, she didn't just shift a narrative, she shifted the lens. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.